Hello and welcome to this special bonus edition of Consciousness Central, coming from Tour de Science of Consciousness Conference 2015 in Helsinki. I'm Nick Day, and in this special edition we are bringing together material that we were unable to include in the daily broadcast due to time constraints. And that includes some conversations with various participants at the conference, including Thomas Tako, Walter Freeman, Andrew Duggins, Tanya Ray, and Robert Cosma. We also have one final trip to the poster session with our intrepid reporter, Cameron Keyes. Cameron also drops in on the civic reception at City Hall that was put on in honor of Tour de Science of Consciousness by the city of Helsinki. And as a special bonus, we have extracts from a conversation between two of the world's most renowned neuroscientists, Walter Freeman and Jean-Pierre Changeau, and that was moderated by Hans Lillenstrom. Plenty to watch, plenty to enjoy, a little longer than the usual show. I hope you will enjoy it and stay with us, and welcome. My next guest is Thomas Tako. He is a philosopher, associate professor of philosophy at the University of Helsinki. He is also co-chair of this conference, Tour de Science of Consciousness. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you, Nick.
And perhaps you could tell us a little bit, what's your interest in where the intersection, shall we say, of philosophy and consciousness? How does that work for you?
Right, so my angle is metaphysics. My work is primarily in metaphysics, and I was pleased to get this Metaphysics of Consciousness session going on. It's one of our plenary sessions this year with some prominent metaphysicians. So I'm interested in the intersection of metaphysics and consciousness in particular, but that brings in empirical stuff too. So fundamental physics is one aspect that you have to consider when you're doing the metaphysics of consciousness as well. So I think that's a nice way to bring together some of the main themes of the conference, actually, by the metaphysics of consciousness aspect. So that would be my personal angle to the conference and consciousness as well, via the metaphysical aspects of it.
Right. So could you open that just a little bit and sort of perhaps just explain a little bit how metaphysics helps us? You know, what's the way in there?
Sure. So one hot topic in metaphysics is surrounding the notion of fundamentality. And this is just the idea that the world consists of some fundamental bits and bobs, your fundamental particles, say, your electrons and your bosons and fermions and so on. And your physicalists in philosophy of mind, they'd want to say that really all there is fundamentally are those small bits that everything else is structured out of, including consciousness, of course. And the big debate, of course, in philosophy of mind is between physicalism and some sort of dualism, or the view that you can't reduce consciousness all the way down to those fundamental bits. So one question that the metaphysics of consciousness deals with would be things like whether some sort of reduction is possible, and if so, how do we do it? But rather than actually looking into all of the physics and the science behind it, you might be interested in just trying to clarify what does it mean to reduce one thing to another. So looking at the concept of reduction rather than all of the details about this. Then you go and apply it to these different fields. So is everything fundamentally physical? And if so, can we reduce everything to the physical? Or do we have some sort of layered structure of reality, and some of those layers being non-reducible to the fundamental physical level? And what does that mean exactly?
So what does that mean exactly? How does that... Okay, so I suppose we've certainly in previous conferences we've got really gone into this debate, the computationalists, reductionists, idealists, and in a sense these camps are almost, it's almost impossible to, square it. It seems to me that reductionists do have their work cut out to explain how something as unconscious as sort of matter can give rise to this, a sentient experience. Whereas from the other end, if you're an idealist, it perhaps the challenge there is to say, well, if everything is consciousness, how come we see a world of apparent matter and objects and, me and you, separate entities? So where would you be in that kind of spectrum of things? What's your way in there?
You be in on that.
Yeah.
Well, good question. I'm trying to be neutral about a lot of these issues. I just like to look at the things like the concept of reduction and what it would mean for the consciousness, for instance, to be reducible to the physical. But actually, whether that is the case or not, who can tell? I mean, as you say, the debate is very convoluted. So I don't claim to have any particular insight in it. But I don't know. One issue that is interesting in the recent literature is emergence. So looking at it not from sort of top to bottom, but from bottom to top, as it were. So once you have your fundamental physics laid down, what does it mean for new things to emerge from there? Things that are not necessarily automatically reducible to that. So now there's a lot of people here working on this issue actually, and there's a big project at my alma mater in Durham University in the United Kingdom surrounding emergence. So I think that some of the most interesting stuff is going to be happening in that area. And there I think that there is something like a true, what they call strong emergence. David Chalmers has written about this distinction between weak and strong emergence. And consciousness is often mentioned as one example of this strong emergence, that you can't automatically do this reduction all the way down to fundamental physics, for instance. But I think that's going to be the difficult question to answer, right? So I think to make progress here, we're going to have to look this in a more piecemeal fashion, if you like. So just look how, for instance, chemistry emerges from the fundamental physics, and already at that level you might get this sort of strong emergence, the notion of strong emergence going on. Also called Robin Henry, also of chemistry, argues in his forthcoming book, The Metaphysics of Chemistry, that you can't even reduce chemistry to physics in this sense. So if you get this idea going on already at that level, then I think that will help us better to understand what it would even mean for consciousness to emerge, and what it would mean for consciousness to be not reducible in this sort of sense. So I think that's right. Probably there is something like this emergence, so at least it's consistent. The possibility of consciousness being an emergent property in this sense is viable.
That's interesting. I think that's the first time I've heard anybody express this idea that chemistry cannot be reduced to physics. It always seems as if chemistry is some sort of a subset of physics, and in biology is a subset of chemistry, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a new one. A little earlier we were talking with Paavo Pelkanen and Harold Atmansbacher, and I think both of them really share this view that sort of this David Bohm, the Bohmian view, that one model that really helps us understand things is this implicate order, explicate order idea, that there is some deep underlying something, whatever that is, that it just is clearly the implicate that has everything that it takes to build a universe, and consciousness along with it. Is that something you feel is valid and helpful?
Again, I try to be neutral, but I find the idea intriguing. We have been working together with Paavo on some of these ideas a little bit, and I do like the idea that we should look at the big picture, look at the wholeness, rather than be bogged down in detail too much, which might easily happen if we just look at the fundamental physics, But Basil Hiley is a good example of someone who looks at the fundamental physics, but also thinks of the wholeness of it all. So, while I find this all very intriguing, I can't say that I've made up my mind about what we can do with this. So some of these concepts are very difficult to understand, and I think I'm still struggling to get my head around the implicate, explicate order issue. I'll have to get Paavo to help me out a little more on that, I think.
I think it's very interesting when philosophers meet physics, because physics, I guess in a way they do have a ground. You have a ground in logic, you have a ground in mathematics. One of the questions that we've been asking a lot of people, which is, I think I find fascinating personally, and I think some people do, is where this stuff exists. Like, for example, where does mathematics actually exist. It seems to be, it's a map of the territory, if you like, but it's an incredibly elegant and wonderful map. It works beautifully. As somebody said earlier, it could be that mathematics is universal, so any other intelligent, sentient being in another part of the universe could find mathematics, it would match. It would be the same thing, which is quite an interesting thought. That means that it does kind of somehow exist beyond us. How would you regard, where do you think mathematics is in the universe?
Difficult question. Now, I suppose I believe in some sort of universality of mathematics. Certainly a popular enough view. I guess that the burden of proof is on someone who thinks that it's not universal even in this case. So how could it not be when we know that we're dealing with something quite abstract? So, numbers, how could they be different in different parts of the universe? Mind you, I think that we have to be a little bit careful in saying these sort of things, because just the fact that maths, if it is a fact that maths is universal, doesn't mean that the mathematics that they would do some other sentient beings at the other end of the universe would look the same. I mean, we have systems, quantum mechanics is a good example. We have several mathematical systems where we can deal with the same phenomena and get the same results in the end, but using very different looking mathematical systems. So it might be quite a big task to actually translate these different mathematical schemes where we, if we were to come into contact with some other sentient beings with their own version of mathematics. But look, here's an easy way to prove that there must be something universal going on. If they're going to build their spaceships, right, and contact us, they're going to be based on the same sort of principles that we're going to be using. Or if not, the spaceship's probably going to, fall down on the way here.
Yes, that's true. I mean, essentially, their science would have to be based on what we call Newtonian physics, and then Einsteinian physics and some quantum physics. It's all going to be. One assumes that if it's if it's in the universe here, it's in the universe everywhere. One
Sure.
can imagine. So yeah. Thomas, thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to add to that we haven't really discussed? But, please feel free to extemporize a little.
Well, it all sounds good to me. I'm very much looking forward to what's going to happen during this week. We're just getting started. Keep up doing the metaphysics, everyone. That's my message to you.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, Nick.
All right, appreciate it. And now it's time once again to join Cameron Keyes over at the poster session.
Tell us your name and tell us the main idea from your poster.
I'm Lucas DeCero, and the main idea is that we are demonstrating that if you apply certain frequencies, sound frequencies, to human beings, that it can elicit a sensed presence. Now, how this operates is through this 110 hertz that we found in a prehistoric cave site. What it does is that it can lower left frontal activity and increase right temporal activity. And very basically stated, lower left frontal activity, you sort of lose the sense of self, whereas right temporal, you get a sensed presence. So summarized in a nutshell, that suggests that individuals who are aware of these resonant frequencies in natural cave sites had an experience that they would label as spiritual religious. So the idea being that religious experiences can be enhanced with certain frequencies.
My name is John Arnold. I'm actually an undergraduate. This is my first conference that I've been at, and so I'm really excited. Basically, I am saying that Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic theory provides a better foundation for Tononi's integrated information theory. Specifically, it's his idea of the index, because for Peirce, the index is basically causal relations are also representative. He gives the example of an index as a weather vane, right? The weather vane represents the weather or the wind, and it doesn't represent the wind in the same way that, like, dog, the word, represents a furry animal. The weather vane represents the wind because the wind affects the weather vane. In the same way, and so he says that that's an example of an index, and an index is something that has a representative relationship because of a causal relationship.
And so Tononi's integrated information theory, you're saying, could benefit from that?
Right, because Tononi basically, when Tononi is talking about integrated information, he says this himself, he's talking about causal relationships within the mechanisms that make up a system. And so I'm saying that by using Peirce's semiotics, we can see how representation, particularly representation of itself, because I think it's self-representation that Tononi is measuring, we can see how self-representation arises via Peirce's semiotics out of causal relationships.
Hi, my name is Arshan Karande and I'm from Seattle representing Yantraware. And my poster is about looking at the implications of consciousness studies on media studies, design, and interactive media like games. Looking at phenomenal consciousness, we can kind of see that media experiences aren't simply cognitive based, they're also involve a lot of different aspects of consciousness that many media don't really tap into. So what we're proposing with mindful media and contemplative media design is that we can actually re-engineer and reconceptualize media to induce these more anomalous or rare aspects of consciousness.
My name is Stefan Schmidt, and I'm doing research in parapsychology, and I present some experiments on distant intention. Distant intention is when you try to change some person from a distance, like, for example, if you stare at a person and want to find out if they notice that you have stared at them, or if you want to heal some person from the distance, or if you help some people concentrating, stuff like that. And there's been many experiments done in these areas since the mid-70s, and I have had the task to meta-analyze them. So I calculated large meta-analyze and found very small effect, rather not working on the individual level, but if you take all data together, quite substantial effect with a small effect size.
So on the whole, as a taken all together, all of the studies suggest that this some phenomena like this is really significant.
Yeah, there's something going on that we cannot explain by conventional science, because the data behave not according to a random model, which they should, but they show some effects there. So we have to find out what it is and have to explain that.
I'm Rosa Kallionpää from University of Turku, and in my poster we search for the best way to analyze N400 event-related potential results in single subject level. And N400 is event-related potential that is connected to conscious processing. Here is the analysis pathway we used. We used non-parametrical statistical testing of congruous and incongruous waves, and finally we got that the visually clear N400 waveform is not the same that statistically significant N400.
So what does this tell you about consciousness studies, the implications?
We have to test the same analysis pathway with unresponsive patients. We don't know whether they are conscious or not. And
so this N400 might be able to tell you whether a catatonic patient or something is conscious or not.
Exactly.
I'm a psychologist. I'm a researcher on psychical phenomena. And this proposal is a kind of methodology to investigate psychical phenomena like telepathy, clairvoyance, out-of-body experiences, but in a way that anyone could do it through an educational process. Because in general, psychical phenomenon, people think that it's a kind of thing from crazy people, illusion, hallucination, or for special gifted people, high-skilled people. So the difference here is that we are proposing a kind of methodology to perform basic protocols. So we are offering a kind of methodology to be tested in any university, not to show a spectacular phenomenon, but to perform the beginning of the experience of basic psychical phenomena.
My name's Alok, this is my mom, this is Dayal. Basically, our post is very simple. We have no graphs. It's basically a summary of Eastern philosophy with regards to devotion and how that can help your spirit ascend. Then basically there are three main paths. You have the path of knowledge, the path of Garam, action, and you have the path of devotion.
What we are arguing is the best path is path of devotion because it's involved love, and when you love somebody, you get there fast. Yeah, if your child cry for your attention, you give attention fast. So if we are God's children and if we love Him, then God give us attention first, and this is how we get there first. So this is how we get there easily without any much effort.
And where is it that we're going?
We are merging with God. We are merging with God. This is the last day that we merge with God.
Tell us your name and tell us
My name is Alexander Egoyan. I am from Georgia. Yes,
and tell us quickly the main idea from the poster.
I present a multidimensional, holistic view of the universe, which is based on the concept of the elastic membrane. For example, our universe is three-dimensional elastic membrane embedded into the higher dimensional space, and two-dimensional membranes arise from such properties of qualia as continuity, indivisibility, permanent character or elasticity, two-dimensionality, and macroscopic size. This means that our perceptions may be understood as vibrations of two-dimensional membranes embedded into our brains. This is the solution of the hard problem of consciousness. Yes.
Thank you. So we've got our first solution to the hard problem of consciousness tonight. Thank you. Excellent.
My name is Diyal Sandhu. I'm a research scholar from the DI India, and this poster is about when, like in today's era, organizations are in desperate need of extremely fulfilled, creative or committed employees. But all these uncertainties, like they feel stressed, demoralized because of the economic downturn or downsizing in their organizations. So all these uncertainties sensitize them for the search for the spiritual presence. So these all sort of activities which help them, like the mantra meditation, jap meditation, dhyan meditation, which keep their balance, the endocrinal and the nervous control, which increases their mind and the body control and make them calm, relaxed, refreshed, healthy, happier from the inside. This is the key idea of my poster.
So by introducing different meditations techniques, you can produce better workers.
Yes, better workers can produce and they can control themselves during the work. They don't necessarily tensionize during the working hours. They can keep their control. They can track. They can single track. They can focus on their work in their wealth. They can balance their personal as well as professional life both.
My name is Michał Wierzchoń. I'm from Poland, from Jagiellon University, and the main idea of this finding that I'm presenting here is to show that the rubber hand illusion, so the illusion in which you alter the experience in a way that you start to perceive the rubber hand as your own, alters your pain perception. Namely, you experience the painful stimuli that we apply to the real hand under these conditions. Our experience is less painful if you include the fake hand in your rubber in your body schema. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
No, that makes that
so stressful.
I think it makes really good sense. You add the rubber hand, your mind takes ownership of the rubber hand, then you hurt the actual hand, then you experience it as less painful than you otherwise would.
Exactly.
My name is Dr. Sapna, and the idea is generally about consciousness we only talk about the neurons, and my topic is other cells of the body are also associated with the consciousness, and one of these cells is the red blood cells of our body.
And so what did you find about red blood cells?
Regarding red blood cells, they are having property of transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body, but other properties of red blood cells are they are having photoreceptor properties as well as magnetoreceptor properties, and these properties are associated with the consciousness because they flow in the blood all where in the body, and through the brain also, and they are talking to the neurons.
So by doing breathing exercises and things like that, we can affect our red blood cells and derive some benefit?
Breathing exercises, there will in any type of physical exercises, there will increase of the blood flow. And with increase of the blood flow, the RBC will rush to that particular area. Besides supplying the more oxygen to that particular area, they will give the signals also.
My name is Merve Emanoğlu. The main idea is describe phenomenological features of the consciousness of dream and wakefulness are similar. However, in minor part of dreams, the phenomenology of dream consciousness may differ from the wakefulness that is associated with significant electropsychological correlates that should be evaluated with further research, maybe.
And so did you go and watch today's talks about the dream and dream self in the main hall?
Yes, I
Was any of the stuff that you saw earlier today similar to the research that you've done?
Not similar, but we developed a scale and we used the Ramazow scale to develop our scale, and listening to him is so inspiring for us. Yeah.
My name is Bartosz Machrowicz, I'm from Krakow, and the main idea here was that I wanted to check what's the influence of causal belief on the sense of agency. Sense of agency is, kind of basic feeling that we are causing our actions, that the effects that are produced by the actions are ours. And the paradigm I used here was Libet's clock paradigm, and I assess temporal binding. Temporal binding is an effect that we subjectively perceive two events, namely movement, action, and its effect, as temporally closer as compared to these two events occurring without causal relationship. So, this temporal binding is used as a kind of implicit measure for sense of agency. And here I introduced some unpredictable effects in order to see how it influences this temporal binding.
So what was the key finding that you found?
The key finding was that unpredictable effects actually were binded more than standard effects, and it was surprising for me because our intuitive saying would be that if effects are unpredictable, surprising, then we feel less sense of agency. But here, this temporal binding was stronger, which shows that perhaps sense of agency over these effects was stronger. That's one option. But the second option is that simply this temporal binding effect is not that good measure for sense of agency, and this would be also quite important because this effect is known for about 12 years and is used very frequently as this proxy for agency and implicit alternative for explicit judgments.
So do you think that when unpredictable things happen to people that they just assume that there's a causal process at work? Is this superstitious somehow?
Well, it might be the case. It might be the case. Well, it's still unclear for me if it's possible. If it's possible that something that is weird, if I may use this word, that is surprising, we would say that we caused it. I mean, it's something contrary, not intuitive for me. So. Right. Well,
it's very bold to take ownership for something. Maybe it's a response to uncertainty, and we're not sure what happened, but it makes me feel more comfortable to think that I made it happen.
Yeah. It might be the case. Sure.
This is really interesting. Thank you.
I'm very honored to welcome my next guest, who is Walter Freeman. He is Emeritus Professor of Neuroscience and Physiology at UC Berkeley. And Walter has also been long associated with toward a science of consciousness. I think we just mentioned now that he's been coming to this conference since 1994, which is the very first one.
1990, I think. Because
1990.
They just celebrated their 25th anniversary last year.
Yeah, it was actually 20th. So
Was it 20th or
20th
21st?
anniversary last year in
Oh,
Tucson.
that was 94 then.
Yeah, yeah. So we were just talking before that you were saying that you've been involved in the field of neuroscience and physiology since 1956. And I think my question to you was, that was at a time when consciousness itself as a subject was kind of not really considered. It was set to one side.
Well, there were people very deeply interested.
There were, the nature of consciousness at that time.
But I would say the majority felt that this was a sociological process and only suitable in medical field for anesthesia. Obviously, the profession of anesthetists, anesthesiologists they call themselves, is clearly not just to take away consciousness, but to give it back. And for that purpose, they really need to know, have they succeeded in alleviating consciousness? And oftentimes it's very difficult to determine that. And so there's good reason to study the scientific basis for consciousness. But that brings in a host of other problems of defining, well, what is consciousness and how is it produced? How can we measure it? And how can we be sure that someone is in fact conscious? I have this problem when I'm giving lectures to students, that their eyes may be open, but I'm not sure that they're turned on, that they're awake. How do I know? Make a guess.
So what's been your approach to this as a neuroscientist? Is it studying brain function, or are you involved also in more of the philosophical aspect to it?
No, I've been doing experimental work. It has been my great love, is to study the physiological processes of behavior, not just consciousness. In fact, consciousness is a relatively small part of it, because I assume that my animals are conscious, that they can feel pain, and I want to make possible for them to express this, that if I inadvertently cause pain, they can let me know. So the real advantage that I saw is that for the first time ever, after somewhere at least 4,000 years of philosophical debates about consciousness and about how brains work, that we have a chance now actually to go into brains and look directly at what's going on as a way of finding out what our brains are doing. So that's why I've taken such great delight over the last really half century of tracking down the mysteries that beset us as to how it is that this collection of nerve cells can give rise to all our feelings and thoughts and ambition.
Do you feel as if we've moved any closer to providing answers to those mysteries?
Oh, decidedly.
Questions?
Yeah. I've watched the interest in consciousness wax and wane over the years, and it seems that every other generation there'll be a new wave of interest in determining consciousness. At the moment, it's somewhat on the wane, I think, because the same reason that it's waned in other eras, that we sort of exhaust the possibilities, and therefore look for greener pastures.
When you listen to, say, presenters like David Chalmers talking in terms of easy problems and hard problems, how does that sort of connect with what you're doing? Do you consider your problems easy problems, or? I don't know I'm not sure how that feels
No, it's
when
laughable.
you hear that.
I mean, telling a philosopher telling us that the hard problem is one that they have, that their problem is harder than our problem, and I would disagree with that. I think that the problem really takes a back seat. I would say that consciousness is not the biggest problem or the main problem in respect to philosophical issues. I would say it's much more important to understand intention. The study of intention is called intentionality. And it's really a new development just in the last 20 years that it's become respectable. They talk about intention. When I first started using the term, I was told, you can't do that. You can't use that word because the philosophers own it and they know what it means. Before you start making a machine that has consciousness, you need to know what it is and how to measure it. We can't do that at all well from a basic science standpoint, though we can do exceedingly well in the sociological realm. And so I'm a bit baffled as to what to say. This conference is dedicated to consciousness, and I think that it's a wonderful place to meet colleagues and old friends, but that the basic premise is difficult to justify. I'd say that one of the key questions is whether consciousness is continuous or cinematic. That is to say, a sequence of frames. And in fact, it's not either or, it's really part of both, because we experience consciousness as a continuous flow, but then we experience that watching a movie as that, and it's not. It's a sequence of illusions. So I'm not much help in this regard because I don't see that the questions have changed very much, apart from bringing into focus some of the issues regarding the continuity. There's also, I think, that Hammeroff and Penrose have done a service of giving a home to people from a broad range of scientific and non-scientific concerns with consciousness. It's always been kind of an oddball conference because of this broad mix of people. But that adds to its charm and to the pleasure I have of attending these conferences.
My next guest is Robert Kozma. He is Professor of Mathematics at the University of Memphis. And Robert has been towards the science of consciousness in the early days and is here with us now in Helsinki. So maybe I can just start by asking you is, one of the things that crops up, I suppose, when we're at a consciousness conference is how mathematics kind of intersects with consciousness. Seems to be something very sort of ultimately subjective. Mm-hmm. Mathematics is about writing it all down. Mm-hmm. How do you find where's the meeting point for you?
Yeah, all right. So that's a very good point, and maybe that's one way to put what I'm doing. That really for consciousness and for describing the operation of the brain, my main focus is try to develop the adequate mathematical tools, and actually that often requires we need to develop new mathematics for the brain, which didn't exist before, exactly address the issues of subjectivity and something which traditional mathematics didn't have to address. So just if you remember, or just that the mathematics on which today the modern science is based on, it of course goes back to thousands of years, but certainly the calculus and all these differential equations and so on, it's at least 400 years old. It goes back to Newton and Leibniz and all their work, and this mathematics has been very extremely useful for 300, 400 years to develop all kinds of models, describe the planetary movement, how we through a rock, or how to send rockets to the moon. And but it looks like often when you look at the complexity of the brain and the dynamics of the brain in the space-time, and not to mention consciousness as its aspect, then the mathematics what we have traditionally is not it has its limitations. So we need to look something new. Just one way to pose the issue that one of the most prominent mathematicians of the 20th century, John von Neumann, is good. He's for starting from quantum theory, but he's one of the inventors of the modern digital computers in Princeton and so on. By the way, a fellow Hungarian. I am also from Hungary originally. So he, when in his very impressive and I believe very important work about the brain, the computer and the brain, just before his death in '57, he published and put the question: what is the language of the brain? How to describe its operation? And he arrived to the conclusion that, well, whatever is the language of the brain, it differs from mathematics as we know it, I would add, and that's yet another motivation, certainly, what I followed through my work on brain dynamics and consciousness, that what would be that new mathematics what we need, and that is maybe my focus.
It's very tantalizing, like how do you write it down? How do you express it? And clearly one of the amazing things about mathematics is it's sort of like it's deep truth, shall we say. It sort of seems to express something that is fundamental to the universe and what we call reality. Mm-hmm. And consciousness seems to be this just entirely subjective kind of experience of things. So are you, when you start to try to create a mathematics of consciousness, are you talking about a mathematics of the brain and brain function? Or is it something that can, is there a point at which you can bridge to actual direct experience? Is that possible?
Yeah, all right. So yes, certainly my starting point in this field really goes back to neuroscience, and since about 20 years ago I started to work with Walter Freeman from Berkeley Neuroscience. That insight what I could gain about the complexity of the operation of the brain and of complexity on this in the space and time, that gave me some motivation and also some clues that what would be an appropriate novel way of developing mathematical tools. Now, just maybe more directly respond to your very justified note about that how mathematics of the consciousness could be objective. So let's put maybe one way to put it is that in some sense let's say Newtonian mathematics as we know it, it's really I would consider a disembodied mathematics in the sense that we use a similar form of different differential equation, but similar form of mathematics for describing the motion as you walk on the street, or as the birds fly, as the waves are moving, and so on. So the differential equations as a tools are universal, and that serves very well those objects. But it looks like that when we describe the complexity of the brain operation and also consciousness, then you should be able to have a tool which is more intimately connected to the subject it describes. So it's not, that's one way to put it, it's not disembodied, it's really what you describe, it shapes the tool itself. So that is one way to describe this.
Okay, well, Robert, thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon. And now for the very last time at Tour de Science of Consciousness 2015, we're going to go to our intrepid roving reporter who has sat through a lot of plenaries yesterday. Cameron, that was a marathon session. What happened in the plenaries?
We had a lot to talk about today, but we're going to go through it lickety-split here.
Excellent.
We've got 7 talks. 3 of the first plenaries were philosophers. So we had Philip Goff, who told us a little bit about the history of philosophy and where it separated mathematical physics from the study of consciousness. And he said that mathematical physics, Galileo and all of these fellows, that the project was never to describe the whole of reality. It was just to focus on causality and to leave everything else that wasn't purely described in physical mathematical terms out of the picture for the time being, because it would be more useful that way. So he just said, now to 21st century consciousness studies, we should be able to bring back all of that mathematical physical explanation, the sort of physicalism, and then have a coherent view of where consciousness fits in, and get together with everybody and develop some more coherent perspectives that take account of all of reality, not just causality, because there's more to the world. The next 2 speakers, James Ladyman and William Seeger, both share a kind of perspective. They call it ontic structural realism. They're concerned to find what is the most coherent form of scientific realism. And they actually reject or decide not to go with the form of physicalism that some of the previous speakers, Alyssa Ney and Philip Pompidou, talked about. Or David Pompidou, sorry. These guys say that it's structure that defines what gets saved over time when scientific theories change. So instead of saying that every physical event has to have a physical cause, we can say, you know, there's more than just, we don't really know what those physical causes are, so we should focus on the structure of science. So we have physics that has a certain place that is very central. We have biology, we have chemistry, all these different areas, these structures of scientific thinking are really important, and they can be given their own ontology, their own place, and when we take a weaker view of realism, then we might be able to get some more progress. So then we went to Patricia Churchland for a keynote, and she's great because she brings this hardcore neuroscience perspective together with a good grasp of philosophy. So she told us about some good experiments in science, how similar we are to rats in the structure of our brain.
Oops, it's out now.
Yeah, and so apparently, you know, it's striking how many of the structures in our brain apparently are the same as rats, and how many social behaviors rats exhibit that we normally think are very human, like altruism and all these kind of things. So she told us all about that and really made some convincing arguments that we should keep an open mind and we should search for mechanisms for how the brain connects to consciousness. And then, so after that, we had a following plenary, which was with Sue Blackmore, Deepak Chopra, and Rocco Gennaro. Sue, of course, told us the history of her out-of-body experiences in the early 1970s and how she dedicated her life to proving the existence of the soul exiting the body in these experiences. But she, no matter how hard she tried, she could not prove that these things were actually happening. And so, like a reasonable person normally would, when you get new evidence, she made a decision in her life that she was going to change her mind. And so now she's telling us all about all the science that she's learned about that really makes those out-of-body experiences, locates them inside the brain in some place called the temporoparietal junction, which if any of our viewers remember last year, we had Michael Graciano that talked about the temporoparietal junction. This is a place where you form your body schema. All the senses get integrated in this place, and if you tinker around with it through some cool experiments, you can actually give people induced out-of-body experiences. So Sue Blackmore told us all about that. Then Deepak Chopra came and made an analogy that, scientists, we can't help but view the world through models. And so scientists view the world, and their view of the world is just a model. And so he has a slightly different model. It comes from a Vedanta perspective, an Eastern perspective. But he also wants to integrate science into that Eastern perspective. So he told us about some efforts to incorporate meditation and wellness and diet and all these factors that we normally think of as what we need in order to live a good life. And he puts those into an experimental setting. So he'll take people to his wellness center and give them this comprehensive massages and meditation and life instruction, coaching and things like that. And then they do genetic tests to find out how their health indicators are going, and they have remarkable results. All of these basic wellness indicators increase. And so he's saying, if we take this Eastern perspective seriously, we might get a more holistic view of what it is to be human, and then we can integrate that into our science. So seems also quite reasonable. And then Rocco Gennaro told us about some of what he considers the hard problems of consciousness. And some of those, for example, he thinks that how we get new concepts is really difficult, because where we get our physical senses, all of these senses getting integrated, is one thing. That's like the raw data. But how do we associate that with the concepts that really pick it apart and give us a rich, textured experience? So he has an idea called higher order thinking, and it's trying to figure out how unconscious processing and conscious processing can really come from one another. How do we get conscious processing from unconscious? So all of these talks were really interesting, and on these last days, everybody's perspectives start to come together, and you start to get a little bit of, this person and that person share some points of view. So the chaos has sort of organized itself a little bit in these last days.
Excellent. Once again, a wonderful roundup. Interesting that one of the few people in the field to really shift positions over the course of her career is Sue Blackmore, and I've got to give her a lot of credit for doing that, because it's quite hard to give up something if you've held on to one position for 20 or 30 years and then you have to really give it up. Is probably quite hard. We don't see it very often. Must give Sue credit, and obviously she's very sort of colourful and big presence here at the conference too. Deepak, of course, we want to thank, because he's been very much supportive of this effort to bring us Consciousness Central. Sounds like you had a good day.
Yeah.
How was your week overall? Have you been stimulated? Lots of new ideas?
Yeah, and these things always take a little while to process. Everybody that we talked to, a lot of them said, I'm swimming with perspectives. One gentleman told me he had ideas coming out of his ears, and he was so full. So it'll be a while before I think I really gain the conclusions I'm looking for, but that's just like consciousness studies. It'll be another 50 years before we figure this stuff out. So.
Exactly. Cameron Keyes, thank you so much for your contribution. It's been great. Once again, I hope we see you this time next year in Tucson.